Actually, it was in the 80s, like 1986, thereabouts. I can remember I used to what we call gunk hole, which is to get in a boat and go up every nook and cranny of a particular river with a guy named Phil Merrill. And Phil was publisher of the Evening Capital. Okay, that's what it was called then. And he was a friend, personal friend. At one point, we sometimes spend 10 hours doing this stuff. And going just noodling through various creeks and rivers in Anne Arundel County. But at one point I suggested to him, I said, you ought to write an editorial, because obviously it'd be more, anyway, about this idea, which is I called a string of pearls, and I'm sure I wasn't the first one to think of that, so I'm not claiming anything. But I said there ought to be some overall coordination for all the assets that make up the Chesapeake Bay region. This is a unique area in the world, and certainly in America, the largest estuary. And there ought to be some entity that coordinates all this stuff. And this stuff is all the water sports, fishing, hunting, the trails, hiking, the history. Chesapeake Bay has as much history as any place in the United States of America, particularly early American history, starting with Jamestown. Okay, and it ought to be an entity like a National Park Service that coordinates all this. And so he wrote an editorial about the thing. And then my friend Paul Sarbanes, 3-4 years later, it was then the United States Senator, picked up on and got legislation to have a study. And of course, the National Park Service looked at it and said the obvious: this is a heck of an asset for the country. And it certainly would be helpful to have something that coordinates it. And then came the Chesapeake Gateway legislation, and which is kind of a half step. And what Van Hollen and the new Sarbanes, Paul's son John, have done in their proposal is basically call for a land-based park system around the Chesapeake Bay. And they've given it a heck of a lot of study. They had open forums for discussion. They had a set of 10 principles. It was I thought very thoughtfully created. Okay, and if you look at this, if you look at the elements of the legislation and what it proposes to do, to me it's a no-brainer. I mean, it's voluntary for anybody. If you don't want to participate in it, you don't have to. And when I say someone who wants to participate in it, as you know, this proposed park would make up all National Park Service owned entities, properties in the Chesapeake Bay region, fish and wildlife, and then it would authorize the National Park Service to negotiate management agreements with states, counties, and private sector nonprofits. Okay, and it's all voluntary. If you don't want to participate, if you're Calvert County and you don't want to participate, you don't have to participate. If you're historic Annapolis and you own some entities and you don't want to participate, you don't have to participate. Okay. And if you do participate, you participate on terms that you agree to. You still maintain ownership of the entity, whether it's state, county, or private sector. You still maintain management to your satisfaction. But what do you get in exchange for? One, you become part of a system, an umbrella group that it has one of the most iconic, important brand symbols in the world, and that's the National Park Service shield. That arrowhead is golden. The National Park Service, for all their faults, and they have many, trust me, I've dealt with them for many years, is still the premier Park Service management entity in the world. There is no number two. And that brand is priceless. That shield, that symbol, you get that. And so what are the benefits from my perspective, and I think anybody else's, is one, tourism. And that's, once again, that's not tourism that you have to go over the Maryland Bay Bridge to get to. This is tourism that is all over the Western Shore. It's places like Jamestown. It's places like Fort Monroe. It's all over, that the Bay in Virginia, on Western Shore of Maryland. It's so you get tourism, which is good for business. Here's the thing: is it turns me on. I'm a history guy, as you know. Is this is going to highlight little museums out of the way, sites that people don't know about, that tell a story about how the United States of America was created. I mean, it's got Jamestown, as I said, but it's got the American Indian story, which nobody knows anything about, particularly the Eastern tribes. Nobody knows anything about them, except, the Cherokees and a few others down south. But nobody knows anything about Maryland tribes and Virginia tribes. There's a story there. This is a history opportunity. It's an opportunity to bring people here, of course, enjoy the Bay and appreciate the Bay. And when people appreciate something, it's been my experience, and I have experience in this, for example, creating parks, they protect those entities. They become very, they're defenders of them. I built the B&A trail, biker trail in Anne Arundel County, Quiet Waters Park. Those people are in that area are just fierce protectors of it, defenders of it. That'll happen even more with the Chesapeake Bay, I predict, if this thing comes into being, because people appreciate what a unique thing it is. And remember something else: we're not inventing the wheel here. There's 18 other national recreation areas in the United States. San Francisco has one, San Francisco Bay Area one, Boston Harbor has one, Lake Mead, and they can go on and on and on. I just think it's a wonderful opportunity to get organized, a unique region in the world, and help tell the story and let people get involved in it. This is an idea as time has come, and that's just my opinion. But I just think this unique entity and its history, every bit as much as the geology, geographic part of it, is unique in America. It's in the world, and it cries out for a coordinating entity that could promote, coordinate, manage this thing. And I think the structure that Chris and John have come up with, Senator Van Hollen, Congressman Sarbanes, is excellent. I just think it's excellent. And I don't know how, some people worry, as you know, about Big Brother, government getting intrusive, but this legislation specifically says it can't. The Park Service can't do anything to override local regulatory authority, state regulatory authority. There's no eminent domain. You can't force somebody to sell their property. You can voluntarily sell it if you care to for part of a park, but you don't have to.
There are people who will react to this proposal with the fear that this is only going to increase the number of people coming to the shore, which is already not sustainable from a traffic point of view. How do you respond to something like that?
They're certainly right, don't I know, because I live on the Eastern Shore, how intolerable the situation is becoming with the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. But the creation or not creation of this national or Chesapeake National Recreation Area, I don't believe is going to have any material impact, whether it's done or not, on the traffic situation in Queen Anne's County and on the entire stretch of Route 50, both sides of the bridge. I mean, what's the problem? The problem's the oceans, not the bay. Too many darn people want to go to the ocean. If they wanted to go to the bay, they don't have to cross the Bay Bridge to do that. Okay, it's on both sides.
And of course, there's always argument about the cost of these kind of programs and whether or not, if you really cared about the bay, whether there were other more critical things that need to be kind of worked through.
Well, then let's talk about that, because one of the things that advocates for this have said is it'll give us greater access to federal money, and for a variety of things, cleaning up the bay, enhancing these sites, if you will. In 2020, Congress passed the Great American Outdoors Act, I think it was called. And what that did was it provided for full funding. Now we're getting in the weeds, but for the Land and Water Conservation Fund to go to the National Park Service, okay, for backlog maintenance, but also for land preservation, protection. That's like almost close to $1 billion, the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I mean, that's a fund, as people that don't know, it's the revenue the federal government gets for offshore leases, oil, gas, things like that. A portion of that comes into this Land and Water Conservation Fund, and this goes back to the 1960s. And for years, the Congress raided that fund for other things. So the full funding never went to the idea of buying and preserving more land. It just went for other things. Well, in 2020, they changed that, and they provided that for the original intent of the legislation, the money would go for backlog for the National Park System for maintenance, but also land acquisition. So then my point is the National Park Service has money. And there's no question that this is going to enhance our ability to access some of that money. I don't think I wouldn't do it for that reason. I do it for the reasons we outlined, but I think that's a byproduct. I don't think there's any question about that.
Is it realistic to think that this will happen in this kind of environment where people are very wary of these kind of initiatives?
Yeah, yes, I think it's very, I mean, just because of the nature of the legislation. First, this has bipartisan support. I noticed Congressman Rob Whitman, who is, by the way, a scientist, congressman from Southeast Virginia along the Bay. He's supporting it. I noticed that the Maryland Chamber of Commerce is supporting it. The Salisbury area Chamber of Commerce is supporting it. This does have, I bet, Governor Hogan, former Governor Hogan, is supporting it. This has bipartisan support. And as I said, because it's voluntary and because the federal government is not getting any more authority to regulate anything, because there's no eminent domain, which is to say you can force somebody to sell, because there's none of that extra provided in this bill, it's pretty benign as far as government intrusion. I only see upside.
Thank you, Jim. This has been great. Very informative.
David, you're entirely welcome.